I thought I was lucky when I inherited the Blackwood estate, a sprawling, Victorian skeleton of a house nestled in the damp woods of Oregon, free of charge. But my grandmother's will came with a warning I laughed at back then. She wrote, "Feed the stove, sweep the corners, never let the dust settle, or he will decide you are the dirt." I didn't listen. I'm a messy person by nature. I left pizza boxes to rot on the mahogany tables. I let the soot build up in the ancient iron stove until it choked. I let the corners of the rooms grow thick with gray velvet webs. I didn't know I was committing a crime in the eyes of the one who was here first. It started on the 7th night. I was lying in bed. The air in the room felt heavy, oily, like it was saturated with someone else's breath. I heard it then, a sound from beneath my mattress. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't a mouse. Mice are frantic. This was deliberate. It sounded like a tiny serrated blade being drawn across the wood of the bed frame. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking in the hollow silence of the house. The scratching stopped instantly. I reached for my flashlight, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I rolled off the bed and shined the beam into the gap between the floorboards and the dust-covered carpet. Nothing, just gray lint and an old, rusted thimble that wasn't there before. But as I started to pull my head back, I saw the eyes, 2 pinpricks of milky, cataract white light, buried deep in the shadow where the baseboard met the floor. They were tiny, barely the size of beads, but they held a look of such pure, calculated hatred that I forgot how to breathe. I scrambled backward, hitting my head against the nightstand. By the time I regained my senses and shined the light back into the corner, it was gone. Just a rat. I whispered, trying to convince the cold sweat on my skin to dry. Just a big, pale rat. But rats don't move the furniture. When I woke up the next morning, the house felt wrong. I walked into the kitchen and stopped dead. Every single cabinet door was open. Not just ajar, but swung wide until the hinges groaned. And the stove, the ancient coal-burning stove I had ignored for a week, was packed. Not with wood. It was packed with MY things. My toothbrush, my car keys, my socks, all shoved into the iron maul and covered in a thick, sticky layer of what looked like black bile. And then I saw the footprints in the spilled flour on the counter. They were human. Miniature, barely 5 centimeters long, but human. Except the toes didn't end in nails. They ended in long, thin needles. I felt a chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty house. I realized then that I wasn't alone. I was being judged. "I'm sorry," I shouted into the empty kitchen, feeling like a lunatic. "I'll clean it up. I'll fix it." A low, rattling hiss came from the darkness of the pantry. "Too late," a voice rasped. It sounded like 2 pieces of dry sandpaper being rubbed together. "The debt is rotten." I spun around, but the pantry was empty, except for one thing. Hanging from a meat hook in the center of the walk-in closet was a small doll I'd found in the attic. It had been decapitated, and in place of its head was a rotting apple, carved into the likeness of MY's face. The apple was already turning black. I realized then, he wasn't just the spirit of the house. He was the master of it, and I was just waste. And waste has to be removed. I didn't stay in the kitchen long. I couldn't. The sight of that rotting apple, carved with my own features, made the air feel like it was thickening into liquid. I backed out of the room, my boots tracking white flour across the floorboards. I was making more mess. I was making things worse. I ran to the front door, grabbing the heavy brass handle. I pulled. It didn't budge. It wasn't locked, not in the traditional sense. It felt like the door had simply become part of the frame, fused together as if the house itself had healed over the exit like a scar. I pounded on the wood until my fists throbbed. "Let me out," I screamed. "I'll hire cleaners. I'll fix everything." A soft, wet sound came from the darkness of the hallway behind me. "Slop, Slop, slop. I spun around, my back pressed against the immovable door. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, shaking in my grip. At the far end of the hall, near the shadow of the grandfather clock, I saw him again. He was standing in the center of the rug, 20 centimeters of gray, wrinkled malice. Up close, he didn't look like a man at all. His skin was translucent, like parchment soaked in oil, and his limbs were too long, too spindly. He was holding something in his tiny, gray hands. A needle, a long, curved upholstery needle, threaded with something dark and wiry. As he stepped closer into the light, I realized what the thread was. It was my own hair, a long strand of it, pulled from my hairbrush while I slept. The master does not want help, he hissed. The sound didn't come from his mouth. His jaw stayed locked, a row of needle-thin teeth visible behind his gray lips. The voice seemed to vibrate out of the very walls. The master wants order. He pointed the needle at me. You are untidy, he whispered. You leave leaks. You leave brains where they do not belong. Before I could move, he vanished. He didn't run. He simply collapsed into the shadows of the floorboards. I bolted for the stairs, thinking I could jump from second-story window. My breath was coming in jagged gasps. My inner monologue was a screaming loop of get out, get out, get out. I reached the landing of the second floor, but as I stepped toward the window at the end of the hall, I felt something tighten around my ankle. I fell, hard. My chin slammed into the floor, and I tasted copper. Blood. I tried to pull my leg away, but the resistance was absolute. I looked back and felt my stomach drop into a cold abyss of terror. The master of the corners was perched on my calf. His weight was impossible. He felt as heavy as a lead weight, despite his tiny size. He was working fast, terrifyingly fast. He had already pierced the skin of my Achilles tendon with that curved needle. He was sewing my pant leg to my own flesh. Stay, he rasped, his milky eyes inches from my face. We must. Tuck. You. In. I screamed, kicking wildly with my free leg. My boot caught him in the chest, and he flew back into the darkness. I didn't wait. I scrambled up, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle where the thread had ripped through my skin. I reached the window. I grabbed a heavy glass vase from a side table and smashed it against the pane. The glass didn't break. It felt like hitting a wall of solid rubber. The vase bounced off, shattered on the floor at my feet, and the shards, instead of lying still, began to crawl. Thousands of tiny pieces of glass were being dragged across the floor by unseen hands, moving toward the corners of the room. Not neat. The voice echoed from under the floorboards beneath me. I realized then that he wasn't just angry about the dust. He was obsessed with a version of order that didn't include a living, breathing human. To him, I was just a pile of disorganized parts, and he was going to organize me. I crawled away from that window, my breath hitching in my throat, sounding like a broken bellows. The pain in my ankle was a rhythmic, white-hot throb, but the psychological terror was worse. Every time I looked at the floor, I saw the shards of the broken vase disappearing into the cracks between the floorboards. The house was consuming the mess. It was cleaning itself, and I was the next stain on the list. I retreated into the bathroom, the only room with a heavy bolt on the door. I slammed it shut and slid the metal bar into place. Clack! I slumped against the porcelain of the bathtub, shivering so hard my teeth rattled. I needed to think. I needed a plan. But my mind kept going back to that needle, and the way his skin felt against mine. Cold, like wet clay. It's just a hallucination, a lie to the empty room. Dehydration, mold spores, something in the air. But then I looked down at the drain of the sink. A clump of my own hair was beginning to rise out of the metal grate. It wasn't being pushed up by water. It was being woven. I watched, paralyzed, as the hair twisted and braided itself into a tiny, rope-like noose. And then, The voice came, not from the hallway, but from the pipes beneath me. The bones. The voice gurgled, wet and metallic. They are cluttered. 206 pieces. Too many pieces. I stood up, backing away from the sink, but the floor beneath my bare feet felt, shifting. I looked down and saw that the grout between the floor tiles was oozing a thick, black substance. It smelled of old grease and burnt hair. Suddenly, the bathroom mirror began to fog up. Not from steam. There was no hot water running. It was being fogged from the inside. A tiny hand pressed against the glass from the other side. A gray, four-finger palm. "We will fold you," the master whispered. The bolt on the door began to unscrew itself. I watched in absolute horror as the heavy metal screws turned, one by one, driven by an invisible force. Squeak, squeak, squeak. They dropped to the floor without a sound, landing softly as if the house didn't want to make a noise. The door didn't fly open. It drifted, an inch at a time. I grabbed a heavy bottle of bleach from under the sink, my knuckles white. "Get back," I screamed. "I'll burn this whole place down. I swear to God." The master appeared on top of the door frame. He was crouching like a gargoyle, his long, spindly toes gripping the wood. In his hand, he wasn't holding the needle anymore. He was holding my straight razor. He had opened it. The steel blade caught the flickering light of the hallway, a jagged, silver grin. The skin. He hissed, his milky eyes fixed on my throat. "It is wrinkled. It needs ironing." He leapt. I swung the bleach bottle, but he was a blur of gray motion. He landed on my shoulder, his weight nearly knocking me into the tub. I felt the cold sting of the razor graze my cheek. I grabbed at him, my fingers closing around his torso. He felt like a bundle of dry twigs wrapped in wet leather. He was stronger than a creature that size had any right to be. He shrieked, a sound like a hawk being crushed, and bit down on my thumb. I threw him against the wall. He hit the tiles with a sickening thud, but he didn't fall. He stuck to the wall like an insect, his long fingers splayed out. Unfinished. He growled. He looked down at the floor. The black ooze from the tiles began to rise up, forming thin, whip-like tendrils that wrapped around my ankles. They weren't just holding me. They were pulling. They were pulling me toward the dark corner behind the toilet, a space no more than 4 inches wide. "You will fit," he whispered, unfolding the razor again. "We will make you fit." I felt my legs being dragged toward that impossible gap. My bones groaned under the pressure. I realized then, he wasn't just going to kill me. He was going to file me away. The pain was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just the sting of the razor on my cheek or the bite on my thumb. It was the pressure. My ankles were being forced toward that 4-inch gap behind the porcelain, and I could hear my joints popping. My tendons were stretching to the point of snapping like over-tightened guitar strings. "Stop, please," I howled, my fingernails clawing at the tile, trying to find a grip. But the master just sat there, perched on the wall like a parasite, watching with those milky, unblinking eyes. He began to click his tongue. TSK, 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 a sound of disappointment, as if my screaming was just more noise that needed to be silenced. With a surge of desperation, I remembered the bottle of bleach I dropped. It was rolling near my left hand. I snatched it up, ripped the cap off with my teeth, nearly choking on the chemical fumes, and sprayed it blindly at the corner where the black tendrils were emerging. The effect was instant. The black ooze hissed and recoiled, bubbling away like acid on skin. The pressure on my ankles vanished. The master let out a piercing, glass-shattering shriek. He hated the smell. It was too sharp, too artificial, too clean, in a way he couldn't control. He scrambled up the wall and disappeared into the ventilation duct above the shower. I didn't wait. I stood up on my shaking, bruised legs and bolted out of the bathroom. I didn't go for the front door this time. I knew it was fused shut. I headed for the basement. The old coal chute. It was a narrow metal tunnel that led to the backyard. If I could squeeze through, if I could just get to the grass, to the dirt, maybe I'd be free of his order. I reached the basement door and threw it open. The air that hit me was cold, smelling of 100 years of neglect. I ran down the wooden stairs, each step groaning under my weight. Creak, snap. I reached the bottom, my flashlight beam dancing over stacks of old newspapers, rusted gardening tools, and a massive, hulking shape of the central furnace. I froze. The furnace, it was humming, but not with the sound of fire. It was a chanting, a low, rhythmic vibration that felt like it was coming from deep underground. I turned my light toward the coal chute, my only hope for escape. But as the beam hit the metal door, I saw him. He wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows of the furnace were 3 more of them. One was even smaller, maybe 10 centimeters, with skin the color of soot. Another was bloated, its belly distended like a tick's, dragging a heavy iron file behind it. And in the center stood my master. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were assembling. The dust must be collected. The bloated one croaked. Its voice was deeper, like the sound of grinding stones. The meat is clutter, the master whispered, stepping forward. I backed away, but my heel hit something soft. I looked down. The old newspapers weren't just piles of paper anymore. They had been folded intricately into the shapes of human organs. A paper heart, paper lungs, a paper brain, all laid out on the basement floor in a perfect anatomical display. They weren't just trying to kill me. They were auditing me. We have the template. The soot-colored one hissed, holding up a shard of the broken vase I'd smashed earlier. The furnace door slowly swung open. Inside, there was no flame, only a swirling vortex of gray ash and hair, a cyclone of everything the house had ever rejected. You will be the fuel, the master said, raising the straight razor. Then, you will be the ash. Ash is neat. They began to move, not running. They glided across the floor, their long, needle-toed feet making a sound like rain on a tin roof. Tap, 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 tap. I backed into a corner, my flashlight flickering. The batteries were dying. In the fading light, I saw the master leap onto a low-hanging pipe above my head. The first. Peace, he whispered, leaning down. He didn't go for my throat. He went for my ER. He wanted to start the inventory, one limb at a time. The razor-thin blade of the straight razor brushed against the top of my earlobe. I could feel the coldness of the steel, a sharp, sterile chill that promised a clean separation. No! I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore my throat. I ducked my head and lunged forward, charging blindly through the circle of gray, shriveled figures. I felt a tiny, needle-tipped hand snag the back of my shirt, the fabric ripping like paper. I didn't look back. I crashed into a stack of old wooden crates, sending them tumbling. Crash, splinter, thud. The sound was chaotic. To them, it must have been like a symphony of sins. Messy, the bloated one roared, its voice vibrating through the soles of my feet. So much untidiness. I scrambled toward the coal chute, my fingers clawing at the rusted iron latch. It was stuck, seized by decades of oxidation and something else. Looking closer, I saw the latch had been wrapped in hundreds of strands of cobweb, braided together into a cord as strong as steel cable. I yanked at it, my muscles screaming. Behind me, the sound of the furnace intensified. The vortex of ash and hair began to spill out of the iron door, crawling across the floor like a gray, suffocating tide. TSK, TSK, TSK. The master was back on the pipes, crawling upside down above me like a starving spider. He dropped. He landed on my back. his tiny knees digging into my shoulder blades with the weight of a heavy stone. I felt his spindly fingers wrap around my jaw, pulling my head back. The razor was inches from my eyes. "We must start the filing," he hissed. "We start with the census. You see, too much dirt." The bloated one was at my feet now. It didn't use a razor. It used the iron file. It began to rasp the tool against the bone of my ankle where the master had previously sewn me. Scrape, rasp, scrape. The pain was blinding. I could feel the heat of the friction, the way the metal bit into the bone. I was being dismantled, 1 millimeter at a time. I screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, and swung my arm back, catching the master in his distended belly. It felt like hitting a bag of wet sand. He flew off me, hitting the coal chute door with a metallic clang. The impact did what my strength couldn't. The rusted latch snapped. The small metal door swung open an inch. A sliver of moonlight, pure, silver, and blessed, cut through the basement's gloom. "The light is disorder," the soot-colored one shrieked, covering its milky eyes. I didn't hesitate. I shoved my hands into the narrow chute. It was tight, designed for Cole, not a grown man. The jagged metal edges bit into my shoulders, tearing my skin, but I didn't care. I pushed. I kicked. I felt the bloated spirit's file sink into the heel of my boot, trying to drag me back into the dark. "You are the dead," the master screamed from below. I felt a sharp, agonizing sting in my calf. He had used a razor, a deep, vertical cut, but the adrenaline was a flood, drowning out the pain. I gave one final, desperate heave, my ribs groaning against the metal tunnel. I popped out like a cork from a bottle, tumbling onto the wet, dead leaves of the backyard. I didn't stop to breathe. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. I looked back at the house. The basement window was tiny, and there, pressed against the glass, were 4 sets of small, gray hands. The master wasn't screaming anymore. He was just watching. He raised the straight razor and slowly, deliberately, wiped my blood off the blade with his thumb. "Outside is big," he whispered through the glass, his voice a faint vibration in the night air. "Big is untidy, but the inside is ours." I backed away, tripping over an overgrown bush until I reached my car. I fumbled for my backup key in the magnetic box under the wheel well. My hand was shaking so hard I dropped it twice. Finally, the engine roared to life. As I peeled out of the driveway, the headlights swept across the front of the house. Every single window was now open, and in every window, a small, 20-centimeter figure stood. They weren't moving. They were just waiting. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My cheek was sliced. My ear was nicked, and my thumb was missing a perfect, circular piece of flesh. I looked down at the passenger seat. My heart stopped. There, sitting on the leather, was a tiny, perfectly folded square of gray cloth. I recognized the pattern. It was a piece of the shirt I was wearing, and inside the fold was a single, rusted thimble. They didn't just want the house clean. They had followed me, because now I carried the dirt with me. I drove. I didn't just drive, I flew. The speedometer needle hovered near 90, the engine of my old sedan screaming in protest as I tore away for Blackwood Estate. I didn't stop for red lights. I didn't stop for the burning sensation at my ankle. I just needed distance. Miles. I needed miles between me and that filthy order. I reached a motel 3 towns over. The Sleepy Willow. Its neon sign flickered with a tired, buzzing hum that felt like a sanctuary compared to the rhythmic chanting of the furnace. I paid the clerk in cash, my hands tucked into my pockets so he wouldn't see the blood or the missing chunk of my thumb. I locked the door of room 214. I chained it. I shoved a heavy dresser in front of it. "I'm safe," I whispered, sliding down the wall. "It's a different house. Different rules. He's not here. I stripped off my ruined shirt. I went to the bathroom to wash the grime from my face. I turned on the faucet, let the water run hot. So hot it steamed the mirror. I needed to see my wounds. I needed to see that I was still whole. I wiped the fog from the glass. My reflection looked back at me. I looked like a ghost. But as I leaned in closer to inspect the gash on my cheek, I saw something in the background, in the reflection of a shower curtain. Right at the bottom corner, there was a small, dark distortion. A lump, no bigger than a fist. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just watched the mirror. The lump moved. It wasn't under the curtain. It was inside the lining. The plastic stretched and groaned as something tiny and sharp moved behind it. Scritch, scritch, scritch. No. I breathed. No, no, no. I reached for the edge of the curtain and yanked it back with a violent sob. Empty. The tub was dry. The drain was clear. I started to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that bordered on a scream. It's in your head, Marcus. It's just the trauma. You're out. You're out. I walked back into the main room and collapsed onto the bed. I needed sleep. Just an hour. Just enough to stop the world from spinning. I closed my eyes. The hum of the motel's air conditioner acting as a white noise to drown out the memory of the basement. Buzz. Buzz. Click. The air conditioner stopped. The room plummeted into a heavy, artificial silence. Then, I heard the sound. Not from the corners. Not from under the bed. It was coming from inside my pillow. Crinkle. Snap. Crinkle. I froze. I didn't move a muscle. I felt a tiny, rhythmic pressure against the back of my neck. Something was tapping. 1, 2, 3. I bolted upright, ripping the pillow away and throwing it across the room. It hit the wall and burst open, but feathers didn't come out. Hair came out. Thick, matted clumps of black hair. My hair spilled from the casing. And there, buried in the center of the mess, was the master. He was smaller now, shriveled, like a raisin that had been soaked in bile. But his eyes, those milky white pits, were wider than ever. He was holding the straight razor, but the blade was broken. He had snapped it into a jagged, serrated saw. The travel. He hissed, his voice vibrating through the mattress. The travel is messy. You brought the outside in. He pointed to the floor. I looked down. My boots. I had left them by the door, but they weren't boots anymore. They had been dissected. The leather had been peeled back in perfect 1-inch strips. The laces had been untied and braided into a complex, geometric web that spanned the entire corner of the room. And in the center of that web was my motel room key. We must. Are you organized? The master whispered. Suddenly, the dresser I had pushed against the door began to shake. The drawers flew open, and my spare clothes began to leap out like living things. They weren't just falling. They were being folded in midair. Shirts, jeans, underwear. They were being pressed into tight, hard cubes. Stop it, I screamed, lunging for him. He didn't dodge. He leapt directly at my face. I felt his needle-like toes dig into my forehead. I felt the jagged edge of the broken razor press against my eyelid. The eyes. He rasped, his breath smelling of dust and ancient soot. They are cluttered. We will stack them. I felt the cold steel touch my lashes. One on top of the other. The steel pressed against my eyelid. A cold, serrated promise of darkness. I could feel the master's weight on my face. A tiny, crushing pressure that felt like a mountain compressed into 20 centimeters of hate. Please, I choked out, my hands clawing at the air, afraid to grab him, afraid that any sudden movement would finish the job he started. SHHH, he hissed. The noise is untidy. Silence is symmetry. I felt the tip of the broken razor begin to nick the thin skin of my lid. A single drop of blood ran down my cheek, hot and intrusive. The master leaned in, his milky eyes reflecting my own terror, and he licked the blood away with a tongue that felt like a wet file. "Waste," he growled. At that moment, the motel's smoke detector began to chirp. Beep, a low battery warning. A tiny, unpredictable, mechanical glitch. The master flinched. To a creature of absolute, ancient order, that irregular, piercing sound was like a physical blow. He shrieked, a sound like a violin string snapping, and his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all I needed. I grabbed him. I didn't care about the razor. I didn't care about the needles in his feet. I clamped my hand around his shriveled torso and ripped him off my face. His jagged blade sliced a deep furrow across my brow, blinding me with blood in one eye. But I didn't let go. He felt like a bundle of dry, snapping twigs. He writhed, his tiny limbs punching at my palm, his needle teeth sinking into the meat of my hand. I didn't throw him. I knew he would just vanish into a shadow. I ran to the bathroom, my vision swimming, and I shoved him into the toilet. "Stay in the drain," I roared. I slammed the lid down and sat on it with every pound of my weight. Bang, bang, bang. He was hitting the plastic from underneath. The strength was impossible. The toilet seat was lifting an inch at a time as he tried to force his way out of the porcelain trap. "The water is chaos," he screamed from inside the bowl. "You are the spill." I reached for the bleach I had stolen from the basement. I had kept it in my bag. With my free hand, I fumbled the cap open and poured the entire gallon around the rim of the lid, letting the caustic, stinging liquid seep into the water. The screaming changed. It went from a threat to a dissolving wail. Gurgle, hiss, screed. I flushed. I flushed again and again. I didn't stop until the water ran clear, until the scratching stopped, until the air in the motel room felt empty. I sat there for an hour, maybe 3. The room was a wreck. My clothes were still folded into those tight, impossible cubes. The hair was still everywhere, but he was gone. I stood up, my body aching, my face a mask of dry blood. I walked to the mirror to bandage my eye. I looked at myself, and I froze. I wasn't looking at my face. I was looking at my chest. Under the skin of my sternum, something was moving. A small, rectangular protrusion. I touched it. It was hard. It felt like wood. I pulled my skin taut, and there, beneath the surface, was the shape of a tiny dresser drawer. "No," I whispered. I looked at my arms. My elbows were no longer joints. They were hinges. I could see the faint, silver, lines of stitches beneath the skin, stitches made of my own hair. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My jaw wouldn't move. I looked in the mirror one last time. My mouth wasn't a mouth anymore. It had been stitched shut with the upholstery needle, and in the center of my lips, where the thread crossed, was a single, rusted thimble. I didn't die. I'm still here, but I'm not a man anymore. I'm organized. I'm a cabinet. I'm a shelf. I am a collection of tidy, broken parts, tucked away in the corner of room 214. And soon, the maid will come to clean. I hope she's neat.